Good afternoon. This is Jack Rogers, the Editor-in-Chief of Business Facilities Magazine. I want to welcome everyone to Business Facilities' new LiveXchange Webinar series. For more than a decade, LiveXchange has been the premier event where corporate site selectors evaluate locations for their new facilities, expansions, and relocations. This year's LiveXchange will kick off on April 17th at the Hyatt Regency Pier 66 in beautiful Fort Lauderdale, Florida. If you haven't made plans yet to join us for this unique matchmaking opportunity, I want to encourage you to visit bfliveexchange.com, where you'll find all the information you need to come on board. In addition to a customized itinerary of one-on-one deal-making meetings, the LiveXchange also gives you the opportunity to hear from our industry's leaders and experts on critical topics impacting today's site selection decisions. This year, we're also inviting some of our LiveX speakers to join us in a series of webinars to discuss some of the most challenging issues that must be addressed to ensure that your development strategy is successful. Today's LiveXchange Webinar series webinar is about the big lies of workforce. When it comes to the critical priority of workforce evaluation and availability, site selection professionals looking at locations for their new projects need to be able to separate the truth from an incoming cascade of false market signals. And there's probably no one more qualified to help you navigate around the cons that are pitched by the pros than today's speaker. Al Jones is the Chief of Scouts at Al Jones Business Growth in the great state of Montana. Al will be sharing with us the wisdom he's accumulated from decades of experience on both sides of the table in business, real estate, and economic development. He's been the man in the middle of numerous turnarounds, startups, mergers, and acquisitions involving a wide range of business facilities. Before we get started, I just want to tell you about a few housekeeping items that will help you enjoy our webinar. First, please note the control panel on your screen. This is where you can submit questions using the question box contained in that panel. You can send in questions at any time during the presentation. As the moderator, I'll forward your questions to Al and he'll address them after he completes his presentation. Also, please note the orange arrow on the left side of your control panel. Clicking on that arrow will either expand or collapse the control panel, so please be sure the panel is expanded so you can access the question box. If at any time you experience technical difficulty, please send a message to us using the question section and our technical folks will assist you. And now, without further ado, please welcome today's speaker, Mr. Al Jones. Good afternoon, Al.
Afternoon, Jack. Well, let's go ahead and get started. When we use the phrase big lie, it's a whopper. Just something that can't be proven and is usually crazy wrong, that's told so often and intensely that people come to believe it anyway. Key concept of propaganda, branding, etc. Endless repetition, bizarrely, helps make it seem like it's true, no matter how silly it is or how you've never seen it actually work. You'll see it emphasized from chambers of commerce, desperate economic development boards, economic development staffers, newspaper publishers, city boosters, governors, mayors, etc. And generally they just pull it out of the air for maybe this will help me get that deal. These lies tend to backfire a lot, and that's one reason we're pointing them out. They're not little white lies. They have significant consequences, particularly for if you do happen to win the deal. Can you actually make a viable business that grows out of it, or is it something that falls apart? Like, been there, done that, where they are never able to fully staff up their facility because they can't find the people. So the jobs aren't created, the company dies, the incentives are wasted. Let's see, there's a lot of reasons we lie about the workforce. It drives up local real estate prices, just as the lack of workers can drive them down. The one I hear the most, and we'll talk about this, the LiveXchange one a little more, is using this makes my workforce competitive and we've got a great workforce here. I use that to justify whatever I want for the local schools, local campuses, why the arts are important, why we need the new theater or entertainment venue, why we need a bigger airport, why we need a professional sports team, why my political party is really bringing home the bacon and the other isn't, why we need or our housing is adequate, why we need broadband, particularly rural broadband, why these nonprofit organizations help us provide a workforce that draws businesses, why the hospitals matter, public infrastructure, et cetera. It's amazing how much this is used to justify what we wanted to do anyway, and typically with no relationship to the recruiting. I would actually try these pitches on businesses that were coming through, and their eyes just glazed over. There's no interest at all. Big lie number one, we have the people here you need for success. I think everybody says that. In reality, we don't actually know who is here. We don't know really what they do or how well they do it, which is sort of a factor of whether they're a competitive workforce or they're going to be your least productive plant site. So we're just saying whatever it takes to lure you here. Our people are often actually poorly educated. There's many states where 50% of the adult population is functionally or completely illiterate. Is our workforce disengaged from years of dead-end jobs with bad supervisors? Very common, and that's a tricky issue. Our people don't have the relevant skills yet for what you need, which can be incredibly specialized, whether it's engineering CAD and CATIA to do helicopter design, which was one we've dealt with, or doing pipe welding, which is one of the more difficult types of it. It's often something you've never developed because you just don't have the jobs there. Or will it take many years to develop into the know-how with training we don't offer here? Another real common one where I'm offering or implying I have people that have 5, 10, 20, 30 years of both training, experience, and certifications, but we can't actually produce them here, at least not yet. So we're like anywhere else with a general workforce. Common one, especially with baby boomer retirements, is that a lot of our best workers are retired, and that's often ignored. Baby boomers are 50%, 40 to 50% of the people retiring out of most of the high-skilled jobs, whether it's science and engineering or, railroad, manufacturing, CAD, etc. If it's an older job, you're losing a bunch of them. A lot of our best workers are single parents, which have different child requirements and different obligations they really can't shift. Poor health. In fact, healthcare benefits, healthcare insurance was invented by Henry Kaiser because all of his workforce at the Long Beach shipyard during World War II had already been separated out as 4Fs or undraftable because of their poor health. That was his entire 30,000 person work group. So he invented the modern hospital and Kaiser Permanente. Long departed workers, that's very common with high-skilled people after layoffs. They literally have to leave the community to find something else. So while the many communities will talk about as though they're still there, they're gone. Their houses are sold. And then there's the classic plumb dead folks, which are people that communities still often take credit for, but literally have passed on. So they won't be available no matter how much you offer them. Offering long gone workforces as though they were still there is a classic. People don't update their information enough. They don't check enough. It's much like campuses, which base their reputations so often on mostly dead or gone outstanding faculty. Big lie number two, we've got a relevant industry cluster here. Well, probably. Well, maybe. Worked a lot with clusters, and it's surprising I've run into hardly any EDs that have really mapped all of their clusters, mostly because the mapping information we get is so bad. Not that I'm talking about Michael Porter and some of the others, but who are a little too general. But anyway, you need to narrow your clusters much further down and really dig into them and talk to your people to really know what you have now, because it's never what it appears on the surface. Companies roughly in the same industry, it's amazing how much they will vary in their actual processes, equipment, pay, workforce, what they do, who their customers are, while on the outside and from the industrial classifications and everything else, they sound like they're roughly identical. But when you go through them, talk with them, meet their workforce, and really investigate them, you find they're radically different, even though theoretically they're competitors and neighbors. And you will find real gems in there that if you really know your cluster and it's relevant to the company you're recruiting, that's a huge advantage. Huge. particularly in terms of supply chain as well as skilled workforce. So it's worth digging through. But are there skilled employees going to leave to work for this new company you're talking about? Existing companies dislike that a lot and can be crippled or even killed by a departure of middle managers, high-skilled people, because generally they only have a handful. So you're talking 1 or 2 people, 5 or 6 in a key function. If they all bolt or mostly, that company may not be able to even do its production anymore. I've seen it. It's always been a surprise. Or the masterful CFO or the really great sales manager. And often the new company is able to offer more money and more hope, promotion opportunities, etc. So a real or imagined exodus is a very big deal. Will you raise wages for this cluster? By coming into it, especially if you're a larger company, that's usually the case, especially if you're used to larger markets or more competitive markets, or you simply know what it takes to attract talent. You'll find in a lot of places real talent's being paid 30, 50, 70% below what they get nationally, just because the employers haven't kept up with what competitive wages are. So there can be a real exodus. And this fear that the new company will raise the wages in the cluster ends up where quite often the local cluster will work very hard to destroy the deal or sidetrack it. Well, not explaining that that's their issue, because that makes it sound bad if they're trying to keep wages down, which usually they are. A tricky one is, have there been significant layoffs, plant closures, plant departures in that community that have stranded a lot of people that you'd like to hire? What's surprising is so often the ED organizations, if it happened a while ago, quite often before that staff arrived, or just within memory, it's forgotten even though those people are still there. There's also a lot of this where there's layoffs and even departures where it's not announced. It never made it into the papers. Only the landlord or the leasing agent is kind of aware of it, and some of the families. Most companies end with a whimper, not with a bang. Majority close on their own volition or shift. So I've found some great workers from companies that nobody knew had left. Anyway. Big line number 3, we can train whoever and whatever you need here, and quickly. Along with having a workforce that in far too many cases is actually illiterate, including high school grads, which is always a shock. Remember, if I'm functionally illiterate, I can't read a menu, let alone a technical manual or complete a job application. So it's really an issue. By the way, there's a work keys test from ACT that's very helpful for finding their actual abilities to read and then actually to do research, like being able to read a technical manual, go through the instructions, etc. And that work keys test is available at about every high school in America and most colleges and state job services. So it's something easily available for siphoning through. One of the things that continually surprised me was how often you'd find workforce that can't do fractions or percentages, essentially second-grade arithmetic. While we would find with a lot of machines manufacturing, we needed guys that could do functional trigonometry, advanced 3D geometry, advanced statistics, stuff that in most places that's not taught unless you're a junior or senior in mathematics at a pretty good campus, often even not then. So it's a weird gap. Many of the unemployed many of the unemployed or even employed have never worked in a business with your requirements. We find that a lot when it's a factory, a call center, a process plant, an R&D facility. The workforce has worked in retail. They've worked in very informally run small businesses where everything's improvised and guessed and made up on the spot rather than there's systems in place. Sometimes the only ones you can find that are used to working in a large organization have come out of military experience. But again, one of the advantages of the vets. But it's a big issue for a factory environment versus the loose ones. And a lot of them are computer illiterate, which you find as you dig through the training. And if they tell you they can use a computer, in fact, they maybe can use a little bit of Microsoft Office. They can work within a spreadsheet but not set one up. They can type a few things, but mostly they play games. They look at their smartphone apps. They don't look things up on the internet. They just use it to communicate and entertain themselves. So there's a lot more computer training for almost anything, let alone specialized languages that you may need, like, say, Mastercam, for programming your production equipment or SolidWorks or various versions of Oracle for your or SAP or ERP systems. There's a lot of specialized software that the community will usually tell you, yeah, sure, we can. But unless you talk to the actual instructors and take a look at the actual labs, it's very easy to be told they have capacities to do this and interest in doing this that doesn't really exist. And a lot of it you'll end up having to do in-house. And pretending that the workforce will sort of pick up whatever they need to is also an implicit one that goes on all the time. I don't think I've heard it more than 120%. But these same folks, if you talk to them, see what they've done, see what they've taken advantage of for existing courses, training, education, on the job, off the job, etc., most of the workforce has not been doing this. They've been waiting very passively to be formally trained. In the small businesses and the small business owners, a lot of times they have developed a lot of informal capacity to learn this stuff because they know it's not going to come through formally. So hiring people out with small business experience, you can get surprisingly versatile self-starters with a bizarre amount of training. The most bizarre ones would be farmers, because farmers typically have a skill set that would match about 8 to 15 different people that they've been doing simultaneously for years. They're just outstanding, along with a heck of a work ethic. The local training capacity, yeah, we got a campus or two here in town, and we'd like to leave it at that, rather than explain that, well, it's going to cost $10,000 to $60,000 and 2 to 5 years full-time or mostly full-time to train entry-level workers for you that we continually find are only about a month or two ahead of what the high school only grads. Now, the campuses think that's a pretty good deal. I've seen almost no employers that can actually afford that or stick with it after they get the first few people and learn how little they know, but they expect to be middle management, expect to be supervisors, and they expect to be paid. They're basically unskilled and expected to be paid a semi-skilled or skilled wage. So they're usually more disruptive than a solution, or much less a panacea. You always want to ask about throughput too. When they talk about we train in this and we have this, ask them how many kids go through, finish the program, not start it, and where they go. Consistently, we'd find capacity that, at best, if it was fairly specialized, they could train 20, 25 grads per year, and we might have 200 openings that we needed to fill within, say, 6 months, say less than that. So you're only a very, very partial solution, and you're not able to scale up with the model you have and the facilities you have. So be very, very, very skeptical when you take the tours of the campuses and the training facilities. The other one we found when we start new programs at the campuses, I spent 10 years on one of these campus boards, the campus typically expects several $1 million from you or the state just to build that training capacity, which they'll try and pick themselves so it's broader based and really slowly implement. So if they tell you a year, it'll probably be closer to 3, maybe 5. It's just amazing. The other thing we find is in most communities, we don't teach anything relevant in K-12 there, as we pretend every child will complete a bachelor's, if not a graduate degree, somewhere else and work in a wonderful imagined white-collar job just like Dilbert. So I always tour the shop classes. I tour the computer labs, talk to the instructors of them, try to find out what they're actually able to teach, and if there's an ability to grow that with the adult education capacity they may or may not have, and the physical equipment. Some communities really step up, most really don't. And ignoring local workforce training needs is pretty much a core value in the hundreds of public schools I've dealt with. But anyway, you can work past it, but not nearly as easily as the person recruiting you implies. Big lie number 4, local pay rates. Our good people cost far less than you've been paying elsewhere, as everything's cheaper here, like, because cars are 30 to 50% cheaper thanks to GM giving the local guys discount, and, well, healthcare is way cheaper, and college tuition and daycare and utilities, and no, actually our cost of living is actually about the same as where you have a workforce. So paying your people, our people, 30% to 50% below what you're paying elsewhere simply means you're getting a very different group of workforce that's going to be less committed, less motivated, and it's going to be less competitive. A counterpoint would be the example of Costco, which when they go into a new market, and they continue to do this, by intent they pay 30% above what the highest paid retail clerk jobs in town pay, as well as their stock options and an actual career path. So they literally skim off the best people in the community and they keep them 10, 20 years. People move up into management. It ticks off a lot of retailers, but boy, do they get a crew that is outperforms, outworks, out-innovates, and are highly engaged. Anyway, on pay rates, we don't actually know what they are for the relevant jobs here and now. You'd think it was a simple question, but what we do with that data is it gets averaged so much from the highest wage within, well, think of it as the most senior salesperson who brings down, say, half the company's sales is averaged with the new salesperson who's got almost no sales and started a month ago. I take the middle number and pretend that's representative when it actually doesn't fit anybody. Much less it confused me. If I want to hire a high-performing group of salespeople, I need to know what the top tier is, not what the general mean or median average is. That lumping together of pay rates this way across it, at best, sometimes your job service, your state employment agent's service will be able to run it in tiers, and that's a lot more useful for getting an idea of how many people in that market earn above, say, $15 an hour, earn above or below 8.5 an hour, earn above 25, earn above 50. That starts to give you an introduction, but it still doesn't tie it back. So this is actually one of the most, it's a simple question that's incredibly challenging to pull together, but it matters so much so that you know you're offering a competitive pay rate to get the people you need that actually stay and do the work right. Another thing that's left out on pay ranges and local pay rates is inexperienced versus experienced, but especially what size of company. Big firms, and this was in Fortune a while back, Fortune 500 companies typically pay 30 to 50% more for the exact same job than small firms do. So if I have a lot of large companies, pay rates higher. If I have almost all tiny firms, pay rates are very low for that same job function and workload. It's even the same difference you find between local, state, and federal agencies, public universities versus private universities, national NGO, non-governmental organizations versus local charities. It's surprising, and it's one you really want to dig into. You certainly want to know who the large employers are of all types within that community, because that will define a lot more about the workforce than you would expect, particularly wage rates, promotion, etc., training, etc. At the wage you'd start people at, how many people in the workforce would this be an attractive job hopping wage? You're usually going after the underemployed rather than the unemployed. So it's how much do I need to improve that wage? One of the other things we found was if their direct supervisor is, I'm trying to think of a polite word to put, but let's say an untrained jerk, certainly plenty of them out there, that makes about between a 50-cent to $1.50 an hour difference in what it'll take them to move. And you can hire away jerks people night and day, especially if you prove that you're not a jerk and your people are well trained. And that's kind of one of those hidden mobilities. It's not just money, it's how you treat people. How much of a wage benefits training package will your company need to draw the best workers in the region? Again, if it's mostly small firms, they often have few or no benefits, more often than not. So the wage rate is distracting, where you're thinking of the wage rate loaded with health insurance, 401k, disability, training, vacation time, sick time, etc. And they don't offer any of that. The wage is the wage, and the employee has to buy all of that other stuff out of their available cash. So the heavy benefits package of a lot of large organizations drastically raises the compensation. And if you promote that and get the word out, it makes a big difference in recruiting. Particularly smarter older workers that have families and have realized how important health insurance is, how significant a 401k can be, stock plans, sick time, that type of thing. 20-somethings think they're bulletproof, so we find the benefits don't really appeal to them. So it's a cost that you're paying that doesn't have near the allure that one would reasonably expect. Other things that are irritating the local workforce: no career path, particularly in small family-owned businesses, obsolete or minimal technology. Sometimes it's 40 to 60 years old, even 80. Unsafe, difficult to operate, and people really want good tools. Rough conditions, and I mean rough, where the building's literally falling down around them, and filthy and filled with vermin and constant electrical shorts and high fire risk and that type of thing. Really bad. And then untrained and capricious owner-managers who drive off a lot of talent. If you've got a lot of those, basically putting together a good modern workplace, you can draw much more of the existing workforce than you thought, but that's not going to be presented to you. Another big lie is, of course, an aspect of this is we have plenty of potential workers for you or anyone. What's the workforce participation of the adults and teens in the area? This, along with part-time workers, can tell you the size of the real local labor pool, while the unemployment figure doesn't give you much at all, especially since, say, 2008, when a whole lot of folks fell off of that unemployment rate. And at the same time, sometimes 3 times as many. Participation tells you how many people are on the sidelines, and that will also vary a lot by segments. It's not uncommon, well, it's actually pretty standard. You'll find, say, like teenagers, where you'll have an unemployment rate of 50 to 70%. Minorities quite often will have extremely high rates, up into the 50 to 70%, but they're just kind of folded into the general. Used to be women, people over 50, people that are disabled. It's worthwhile breaking down the segments to see who, because in the segment that is, say, 50 to 70% unemployed, you can really hire some excellent people out of that who will be very grateful for the work and will also bring in other good people by referral, which really cuts your costs down because they just haven't been given a chance. How many of the people in this workforce are retired? And retired people keep coming back into the workforce up into their 70s, I think even into their 80s, but certainly in their 70s, as opposed to everyone's done by 50, 55. How many are too young? Again, 16 to 18-year-olds have a heck of a hard time just about everywhere finding a decent job, part-time or full-time. How many are locked into long-term jobs, often because they're the only place they could get health care benefits for their family there, or it was the only good job in town that they happen to qualify? How many are unemployable, which we've been discovering with a 5% unemployment rate, about 3%. 4% of those are frankly unemployable. Just terrible habits, terrible problems, and not real interested. It's, again, one reason the unemployment stat's always distracting. How many are in too poor of health, which is often a reason they're off the workforce, but may well be coming back? A lot of people are written off with a long-term problem that eventually does get resolved or healed up from. How many have been pensioned off? A lot of pensioners come back in after a couple of years out looking for something to do and people to network with, and you can get some amazingly skilled people way too cheap off the pensioners. How many have a criminal record? We worked with that group before, and one of the odd things is if they're on probation and parole, they're actually getting more regular drug and alcohol testing than your general workforce, so they can actually be a cleaner crew that you actually know what problems to watch for. How many are addicted? Addiction rates can run as high as 30% in construction, nursing, auto mechanics, printing technicians, etc. So, if you talk about a third of them, maybe of the people you're targeting may be alcoholic or drug addicted, that's going to tell you want to do quite a bit of testing both up front and down the road to try and screen those folks out. How many are transient and have no roots? How many are homeless, which makes it very hard to find work with no fixed address? How many are unable to commute to work, which with a poor population and a scattered rural population, not being able to get to work regularly is a huge issue. And a lot of smart times you can address that by simply running your own small buses or minivans down there and suddenly access thousands of good people that just don't have a reliable car. Family responsibilities, too comfortable living at home to work, students, very limited physicality in what they can do, which, by the way, if you always want to run them through physical capacity testing to find old injuries and actual ability, what they can lift or move, twist or turn. So you're not hurting them and you're not picking up the workers' comp and health insurance costs for an injury they already had. And then how many are unrealistic, which we find if a large employer has laid off people, quite often they're high-wage and low-skilled workers. So you'll find people that literally are at best semi-skilled, but we're making from a large operation because of union maybe 25, 50 bucks an hour. And there's frankly no one else that would pay them that, especially not in this environment or even in the same company. But they haven't come to terms with that embarrassing reality that they were overpaid for what they could do. When I tell you I have low unemployment and less than 5%, it doesn't mean we're doing really well in terms of employing people here. It means we've run out of workforce. And only the worst workers are still sort of available, unless you have an offer that beats the local jobs, better compensation, better terms, etc., which usually isn't that hard, but it's a fuzzy number. High unemployment often reflects that most of this segment of the workforce, the ones that actually got counted in the unemployment stat, lack skills, literacy, numeracy, work experience, soft skills, like one of the new ones that's reemerged is coming clean to work as opposed to long unbathed. Or dressed appropriately or not displaying things that will off-put customers, having artificial horns added to your forehead or such. They lack computer literacy. They don't have clean records in terms of criminal records, driving records, because if they don't have a clean driving record, you can't get them a commercial driver's license or you can't get them insured, which suddenly cuts down everything from running a forklift to driving long-haul trucks for you, and the ability to commute from where they live to decent to good work. I've been amazed how often it really is the question of reliable transportation that has sidelined literally thousands of workers in a region. And it's harder to solve than imagined. It's not something you'll be able to put together a bullet train system to get them from one place to your workplace, like technically actually we could a century ago. Big Life 5.5, yes, there's 10, but this is a bonus one. You won't need a cadre of experienced people to build a workforce here, because people here learn by osmosis and psychic vibrations rather than learning by example, coaching, and how your firm does everything. This surprised me over and over and over. I kept thinking I was dealing with exceptions, but it seems to be the rule, particularly anymore. It didn't used to be. You're just going to send, the company's going to send 1, 2, 3 people, maybe 5, at most, to train everybody after hiring everybody and running everything and setting up everything, and often going through actual construction of a specialized building, bringing in specialized equipment, establishing local and new customers, working out a supply chain. It's just insane. Even if you have the most talented manager in the world who's worked himself up from the shop floor, knows every job well enough not only to do it but to train it, and can do everything else, never sleeps, and works 60 hours a day, it just doesn't fit. What you're going to end up with is a bunch of people that there literally is no one to ask. How do we do this? Why do we do this? What do we do now? Hey, this is broke. Can you fix it? Can you load this? It's just chaos, and it runs for months, usually years to settle down, unless you have a cadre, a training cadre. That's actually a military term where they found when they were building new regiments or companies, they would get 10 to 20% of the total new unit strength of experienced guys, experienced sergeants, corporals, captains, lieutenants, who had actually built and run units before and ideally had served in combat or in the mission in the field. And then, so there was somebody to ask, somebody who knew what was going on throughout the new unit. So you might have 50 new guys with 800 or 800 new guys with 50 experienced people. But if you had a large enough cadre, you could bring them up to speed surprisingly quickly, and you could cover. There was somebody to cover up, fix stuff, make it work, resolve it. If the company hasn't been talking about their cadre and how many they'll bring in, or how many they think they can find who already know those skills, that's a heck of a warning sign. You've got a really unrealistic plan that's going to probably go off the rails, or at the very least be really delayed and at a lot lower production and quality than was expected. And there is a proven way to address that, called training within industry. That is what the War Production Board developed during the Second World War. So still worth doing. Based out training, only worked at 16,000 factories and only trained about 30 million people. So literally taking housewives straight out of the fields of Kansas, and a month later they were doing assembly of the most advanced aircraft in the world, the B-29, never having seen a plane, never having been in a factory. Big lie number 6. Just the folks here in town are your sole workforce. My friends need jobs. That's really incredibly common as an implicit assumption. They're also, when they talk to you about workforce, there's a common pretending that no one commutes from outside the city or even the county limits to a good job, that everyone is just driving literally across town, and the political boundaries describe the workforce, which they never do. Finding out if the actual labor pool is a 1-mile radius or a 100-mile radius is a critical question. And oddly enough, the census does gather this, and often is the only source for this, as well as anecdotal information or counting cars, or actually even just looking at license plates in the parking lots to identify how many are from outside the immediate area. It can be 50, 60%, and a lot of times it's skilled people, particularly these days where there's been a lot of people with skills that have semi-retired or simply relocated to small communities and small cities that are talent you would never expect. Part of the reason that this is understated, and we pretend that the workforce is only within my political boundaries, is the jobs are supposed to go to my voters. Maybe my customers, maybe my investors, the landlords, the newspaper subscribers, the residents of my state. Boy, that's fun when you're on the boundary of a state. You find that you're going for state incentives, and most of the workforce is actually in the adjacent state and driving across the state line every day. So workers crossing state lines or national borders, whether it's Canada into the U.S., coming across the bridge from Ciudad Juarez into El Paso, it's amazing how many cross national borders every day if they can, and work elsewhere. But those numbers won't usually show up in terms of who's out there, what the potential is, or even much knowledge about that workforce. It's usually sort of a guilty secret in the community. Often, when you say, and I want to transfer people in and I'm going to bring folks in, this thing of, no, my friends need jobs and we really didn't want strangers coming in, we just want better jobs for the people that are already here. That's where you get some really evasive answers or outright lies about housing. There's also one of the more challenging ones to get at is why people from elsewhere would move to this town that's too insular. Not that it lacks entertainment, which everyone's ready to talk about, all the things there are to do, but the fact that it's unfriendly or welcoming to newcomers, and that's a radically different range there. And how they'd find jobs for spouses, which we gradually found was a huge one. If your spouse can't find a comparable, good, or acceptable job in that community, most households can't move. This isn't the old days, like when I was growing up, where there's a single bread earner. If the wage is better, moving costs are cheap as opposed to $8,000 to $15,000. People would move for the jobs over and over every couple of years. You know, the old back when the old line for IBM stood for "I've been moved," and routinely moving people every 2 to 3 years to season them, put them in different experiences, different office sizes, different markets. That's all fallen apart with the double income household. And in fact, we're seeing a lot of people when the company moves, whoever's job moved, they look for something else while hanging on to the spouse who's kept a local job. They also don't want people from elsewhere to compete for housing more often than not, unless it's brand new housing, or to stay long enough to matter. And those are essential questions you're not supposed to investigate, even though they matter a great deal. One of the interesting ones on studies on relocated or recruited employees from elsewhere found half quit within 2 years, as they or their family just hadn't gotten comfortable in that community, which can be as simple as finding a pediatrician you like, a veterinarian you trust, a plumber who actually fixes your plumbing, guy who can remodel the house, an auto mechanic that keeps your car running, people that welcome you into clubs and organizations, a church congregation that fit you. Your kids weren't able to make new friends or not as good of friends as they left behind. That's a big deal, especially for the cost of recruiting people in, and then the disruption of losing people typically at a mid-tier or senior level that you brought in a great distance and at great cost, and often after a 6-month or year-long search. So will this community welcome them? How well do they get connected to the community? How happy will their families be is a really big deal, and most don't like to answer it. Big lie number 7, your workers already all live here, so no affordable or available housing isn't worth mentioning to you. And that was one, gosh, been there many times where you'd be recruited in, and then you discover there was in fact 2 or 3 houses available for sale or rent, 1 or 2 apartments within a 50-mile commuting range. And you're going, well, I was going to add 25, 30 people, and they won't be able to sleep inside. And no one's building housing, and it's a depressed enough market that if we build a new house, it'll be worth less because of how slow the real estate market is in that community, which is real common. And that could be anywhere from Cleveland to a very small town. It's worth less than it costs to build, so I can't get a mortgage, or I can't get a mortgage for all of it. I can't find contractors to build it. You're literally stuck, as opposed to, well, we'll just build more houses. And quite often the infrastructure, more often than not, the sewer and water, roads, etc., that's not in place or can't be in place unless you can pay for that up front as well. It's a real nasty trap that actually most communities aren't really aware of or certainly don't want to talk about. High housing cost areas evolved in unexpected places, and that's usually more thanks to developmental policies that limit the land and builder inefficiencies, so that expensive houses are all that have been built there for decades. So let's say, for example, Silicon Valley. But actually, many resort communities, high amenity communities, retirement communities, as well as being landlocked is especially where most of the land is already gone or it's under other control. So the question becomes, boy, that would probably, it often appears to be a nice place to live or a very nice place to live, but do you pay your workers 30 to 100% more so they can sleep inside in overpriced houses? Or do you hope that your workers will tolerate 3-4 hours of daily commuting from the affordable housing that is, say, 50 or 100 miles away, or a long declined neighborhood that they don't feel safe in but they can afford? A high-cost rent or mortgage also makes your freshly trained crew very susceptible to competitors' job offers because they're struggling. They may have as much as 50% of their income going to mortgage payments or rent. So any improvement in what they're being paid makes a huge difference on literally what kind of food they have on the table, or buying a new pair of shoes or taking their kids to the dentist. Makes them very desperate, very easily motivated, because literally it's survival for them. And this comes as a surprise to most employers that I've known, who often only consider their own housing costs when we would take them around and show them. So they're saying, well, show us the executive housing. I'd always take them by the workforce. The housing that the people at the wages they were talking about they could afford, that usually disappointed them. And they said, no, let's just go back and look at the executive housing. Let's not look at what people can afford with what we plan to pay, because that would be embarrassing and shows a limiting factor. Executive housing is always available or buildable. Custom houses are just that. You can always find somebody who will drive enough of a distance. It's the housing that the rest of your workforce can live in that often isn't available. And talking to a lot of realtors or the brokers, the real estate brokers, appraisers, etc., it's a tricky question to dig down on, but more often than not, you'll find there isn't much there. When there's low housing cost, which is very often touted, if I in many communities, it means I have a declining market where new houses can't be built. And while most of the houses that I can offer cheap are 50 to 80 years old, so they were built in the 1920s, 1930s, maybe the 50s or early 60s. So they're about half to a fourth the size of a typical new home. They're literally a 600 to 800 square foot house versus the average has been around 2,500 in recent years. They don't have a garage, or they have a single car garage instead of the 3-car garage that's desired now. They have a tiny lot, so they can't really expand any further. They've usually been remodeled where they're at. Need a lot of work. And in many cases, in most cases anymore, we find they're owned by seniors who aren't interested in selling. They plan to live the rest of their life there, which could be another 10 to 30 years. Or they're already rented to long-term people. So there's just a handful of housing, even though it's a low housing cost, and we can't build more. Again, old infrastructure, and the house price isn't enough to cover the cost of construction of, well, about anything, even an 8-plex. If there's been big layoffs or closings recently, there usually are a sudden lot of available houses for sale, as well as rentals. And that can be an idea. That really is an opportunity. We come into places where, let's say 300 people have been laid off. Well, suddenly now I've got probably 200 houses that are on the market simultaneously, driving each other down, available for immediate occupancy, motivated seller. And that's something worth looking at instead of just the workforce. What's available in housing after layoffs?
Al?
Yes?
Sorry to interrupt. We are getting a little tight on time, and we do have a couple of questions, so you may want to hit the top points on the last couple of slides.
Okay. Number 8 big lie are people are all eager beavers, just thrilled to get to work for you. The desperate workforce is often a traumatized one, not just underemployed or unemployed. And that's what we would find is a lot of people come in saying, I'm looking for a desperate workforce. People that will take any job, any hours, any wages, just something. And those are also the people that don't factor in a high turnover. But people that have basically lost their hope and lost their assets can be incredibly hardworking, loyal, and productive, but realize they come with baggage and particularly trauma. So it takes a while to sort of bring them out of the PTSD that they've gone through. Amazing workforce are the people we find in a lot of communities that are stranded by location, particularly in a small town or a rural area or a long declining market, and just have not connected because there weren't the opportunities. You can get a lot better people than you're used to paying for in those spots, but boy, is it hard to find. But there's only a few thousand such places out there. Number 9, we know our own workforce. We really don't. And number 10, big lie, competition. Other employers, most of the other employers will seem to think of it as a zero sum. So if there's only 2 or 3 skilled people, if you hire them away, I can never develop or train them myself or replace them, so I lose. And that zero sum mindset is very, very difficult to overcome. You can actually overcome it with training, but these are guys that don't think about that. Okay, let's go to questions.
Okay, Al, thank you for a very informative presentation. We do have a couple of questions. The first is, where can we get workforce participation rates by separate segments of the local population, such as teens?
Some of that will be tracked by both the U.S. Bureau of Labor. They've actually been tracking participation quite a bit more, and your state labor department will also be, and to some extent your local branch of them are tracking that. Teens, they do particularly track. One of the scariest things is that we have the lowest rate of work participation for teenagers in U.S. history. So I think it's less than, 45% are actually doing some sort of work. So it also means my young people have like no experience when they're coming out of high school at any job, or very much less than we're used to.
And the questioner also had a related question. Wants to know where he can get the information on the percentage of the workforce that's locked into long-term jobs. These were a couple of the things that you touched on in slide number 5.
Looking at the actual employers, the large employers in the community, is usually your indicator. Those are usually the most stable jobs. And I may be locked into a long-term job in the local school district, local county, local government, which are often these are often some of the best jobs for someone with a degree in the entire community. So they've skimmed off talent that you wouldn't expect, but are bored out of their mind. State or federal agencies, just look at the large employers, and those are typically the most permanent jobs, or at least perceived to be. In the small businesses, it's generally, unless they're in ownership, it's a much more erratic job and more often a lower quality job. So I look at who's at the large employers.
Now, Al, I noticed when you were discussing the sort of the in-house training, the cadres of experienced people.
Yep.
For somebody outside who's trying to evaluate the available workforce, how can they factor in state or regional workforce training programs? In some cases, obviously, the company that is placing the facility there or expanding, they need to have taken advantage of these programs. But should that be part of the evaluation?
Very, very much so, and it's also one of the hardest questions to answer, because you find nobody really has a pool of all of it. There's never while you'll have people tell you this is a comprehensive website that lists all the programs and resources, it's too much of a moving target. There's too many people doing different parts of it, and some of them private, some of them regional, some from outside, some non-governmental, some temporary programs. It takes a lot of digging in each of those communities and really going out and talking to the training providers, which can take about 10 or 15 minutes to separate out the wheat from the chaff. But yeah, it's the state ones, the state will list what they'll reimburse and incentives. The real trick is who are the training providers, and then what sort of facilities do they have? Is it a PowerPoint in a hotel room? Or do they actually have production equipment or labs where they can show it? I guess South Carolina and Alabama would be the shining stars of what actual physical training capacity they're able to offer employers. It's just stunning, and it's way ahead of the rest of us.
I noticed you mentioned the availability of housing, and I know you've done a lot of study on boom and bust cycles, and of course we all know what's happening in North Dakota, where they've had the shale oil boom, but they still have people living out of their cars because there's enough.
Yeah, because their workforce has only dropped to what it was 2 years ago. So is there ever a situation where the lack of available housing has to be addressed before companies can actually expand? I think it almost always has to. Trying to get people in where there is no housing and even housing infrastructure, it's hell. You end up where you're at best you end up fragmenting that crew across many small communities over, say, a couple 100-mile radius, where they're snapping up every available house, rental, etc. They're also spreading across those schools. Well, that sort of kind of works for the company, but for the community, suddenly they've lost just about all that consumer impact of adding, say, 150, 500 people to their local customer base for the grocery store, the pharmacy, the hospital, each of the retail stores they worry about for their tax base. They've lost most of the benefits other than the direct taxes on the business operation, which often they waive to get them. So it's a chicken and the egg thing, but whenever we don't look at workforce housing and we don't actually go out and examine it and talk to people, and we just take the word of the people trying to recruit us, we get hosed. You're literally saying you'll have to sleep in the shop. You will have to sleep in your car. Even it's one of the great conundrums out there, and it's a subtle advantage for places that have lost a lot of population, like Detroit and Cleveland or Indianapolis.
That's true. That's
They've
true.
got a ton
People are
of
coming
actually
back
pretty
to
good
those
housing.
urban areas. We got one last question here. What is a reasonable commute time to consider for medium to high skilled positions?
That's a great question, and I used to have a very different answer for that until reading the census stuff and finding that we had people that were traveling 4 and 5 states, 8 states every week for good jobs by car or by aircraft. You're going, if you travel halfway across North America, yeah, that
people
just kind of boggles
to jobs
my mind.
By airplane.
Well, and literally driving halfway across the continent, or even more so. Gosh, my wife's boss was commuting from Australia to North America for the first couple 5 or 6 months. It's just very, very good job, but still kind of shocking. In general, yeah, they're right about not looking at miles, but looking at time. U.S. News and World Reports was finding that the average commute in the U.S., large cities, had gotten up to about 3 hours, hour and a half up and back, which is a huge chunk of time. Usually, what I've seen is usually more than about 30 minutes to an hour, you start to lose a lot of people, and over time, which over a certain number of years, even they start to change. They either move in closer, or they change their work, or they telecommute more, particularly if they have children at home. That's the biggest factor on the commute side is daycare, children in school, kids' activities, because it's just not an adjustable factor, and it's right at that time.
Okay, well, we have to wrap things up here. We're coming to the end of our time window. Once again, I want to thank you, Al, for an excellent and highly informative presentation. If anyone would like to listen to Al's presentation again or look at the slides, this webinar will be available on the businessfacilities.com website, as well as Al's website at aljonesbusinessgrowth.com. Excuse me. You can also meet Al in person at our upcoming LiveXchange event, where he'll be one of our featured speakers. Al will be presenting a seminar on attracting the millennial workforce. There's still time to register for LiveXchange, which takes place April 17th through April 19th at the Hyatt Regency Pier 66 in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And once again, you can register for LiveX by visiting the bflivexchange.com website. I want to thank all of you out there for attending today's webinar, and we hope to have you join us again next time. Have a great day.